For millions of you around the world, this piece of music has come to mean just one thing: the start of my colleague John Peel's radio show on the BBC World Service. I'm Mark Coles. I've been listening to John coming out of my radio, getting excited about his favourite records, playing sessions from his favourite bands for 30 years now, ever since I was a child. This is probably the hardest, saddest thing I've ever had to do. A programme for, about, but without John Peel. John died earlier this week. He suffered a heart attack while on holiday in Peru. Over the next half hour, we're going to pay tribute to him. We'll hear from his friends, his colleagues, and the many musicians around the world that he helped over the years. For those of us who were lucky enough to meet him, to work with him, even get to know him, the news of John's death still hasn't really sunk in. It just doesn't seem possible. And it seems we're not alone in feeling that. The BBC's internet tribute site has received more than 250,000 hits since John's death. 32,000 of you have sent emails to the BBC World Service wanting to pay tribute to a man whose voice had become a friend. Without John Peel, most of my favourite bands would still be working in an office somewhere, wrote Stuart in the Netherlands. He was an absolute one-off. For me, he was once from another listener in Japan, and had meant to her.
I'm shocked. It's something I need to point out, the way John Peel has been with me. I've listened to him on the World Service, and I used to get up at 6:30 in the morning when I was in India in 1995. He did a show then. It was quite a shock to have first thing in the morning ball chains and root powder mix. And I also listened to him in Tanzania on the World Service radio in the middle of the African bush, bopping to him and getting the local kids to, get on this funky tune and everything. But I feel the urge to go and pick up these tunes now to keep him alive, because he is irreplaceable.
It wasn't just listeners. Many artists and musicians who had met or worked with John rang in to pay their respects too.
My name is Serhat Göksal, from Istanbul. I met in an interview with John Peel, first in '94, in BBC World Service, shortly after his visit to Istanbul. He said he listened my music and liked it very much. Since then we were in touch and played many tracks from me. He has especially an important part in my music life, because he was the first person supporting me internationally. Since we met, my music life took a long way, and I joined several international music festivals as well as making tours, concerts in all around the world. But his opinion always remained a great motivation for me.
The DJ Paul Gambaccini agrees. John Peel, he says, changed radio, music and the music industry.
You can say without question, because there is no doubt, that John Peel broke more artists in popular music than anyone in the history of the Western world.
Black Sabbath singer Ozzy Osbourne.
Terrible loss to the music industry. He was a pioneer in his own right, man. If it wasn't for John Peel, Black Sabbath would never have got played on the radio. A huge loss. To music in general, it's a terrible loss. He was a good guy.
Conor McNicholas is editor of the music magazine New Musical Express.
John Peel gave each generation a whole new musical language that they could call their own.
The BBC DJ Andy Kershaw.
He was the single most important figure in British popular music in the last 40 years.
Damon Albarn is lead singer with the band Blur.
He had the spirit of music inside him, and that's what will be remembered, and I would hope that the BBC, don't forget that spirit ever.
One of John Peel's favourite bands were The Undertones. This is their song, Teenage Kicks. Their former singer, Fergal Sharkey, has joined me. Fergal, what impact did John have on your life?
Late in 1978, my life changed completely because of a man called John Peel playing a little record called Teenage Kicks on the radio. And here I am now in the autumn of 2004, and it's changed again.
How did it change your life?
It was that simple act that John did that is in many ways totally reflective of his character, that he just kind of so unselfishly gave to others all the time. And that allowed 5 little lads from Northern Ireland the opportunity to go and do the thing they wanted to do most, and that was make music. But that was not by any means some sort of one-off isolated case. It was just something John endlessly repeated over the whole course of his career as a broadcaster. And you can go all the way back to Jimi Hendrix, T-Rex, the Undertones, the Smiths, Joy Division, right up to the White Stripes, and a whole plethora of stuff in between. And I think that's perhaps the bit that people outside of the kind of core music industry radio fans don't, but really should appreciate. That it was John who gave that first opportunity to any amount of music that has impacted and touched the lives of millions all over the world, not just in this country.
Not just music in many ways, is it? It's the magic of radio he created. I mean, I know I wouldn't be in radio if it hadn't been for me listening as a 12, 13, 14-year-old to John Peel and the music programmes.
Well, I think, it was one of those things that was possibly obvious to people that had met him, that he did have that fantastic gift of the gab and was an unbelievably good orator. I think the bit that John really understood was how to talk to musicians and his audiences alike, and how to talk to them on a one-to-one basis in a language and on a level that they felt comfortable with. And that was an incredibly important gift.
Because that was the beauty of it, wasn't it? Because in those days, I was listening in the early 70s, and then when you came along and the rest of punk and new wave bands, and I was there listening to your records that he was playing. But there was that, he just talked like he was one of the rest of us. It was like mistakes, he'd put the records on at the wrong speed, he'd play 45s at 33, and, there was no problem. He was just doing it.
Yeah, but it didn't matter, because that just all added to the uniqueness that was John Peel. And I think that's, apart from the kind of incredible loss that I know an awful lot of people are feeling today, I think long term, that's one of the biggest impacts it is going to have, is leaving quite a large void, certainly in terms of broadcasters, because there was no one else prepared to do that, or willing to do it, or motivated enough, or understanding enough, or driven enough to even want to do it. And it's something that's going to be sorely missed from all of our lives. And it would be nice to think there might be a broadcaster out there prepared and capable of rising to that challenge. But those are going to be big shoes to fill.
What are your fondest memories of him?
Just seeing him out and about, and just knowing that he was always there. And knowing that, and I think it's the bit that people miss the most, knowing that there was always that opportunity to turn the radio on and just hear this mad, crazy, noisy stuff coming out of it. But every so often would be this complete spark of genius that John had discovered before anybody else even knew it existed.
Because it was mad and crazy, wasn't it? I mean, I remember listening, and one minute you'd get, Bebop Deluxe, then you'd get the Ramones, and then you'd have an old Rod Stewart record, and then there'd be something you'd listen to maybe from the 1930s recording that he'd brought in a...
It was, but that was half the joy of it, and, I mean, I've told it to him, so I don't mind telling the rest of the world. There's times I find it unlistenable. And, especially when he was going through his kind of Munich industrial phase.
I remember that well, yeah.
I couldn't get my head around it. But at the other side of it, I also remember talking to an incredibly well-known, high-profile dance DJ on Radio 1, whose show for a while butted up against John's. And he finally confessed to me that he would spend all week worrying about the last record he was going to play, because he knew perfectly well John Peel was going to drop some techno record or some dance record that just blew away everything that other DJ had been playing for the previous 2 hours. And he became quite paranoid about it. That was John's gift, and it was just by that process of digging around constantly. And still, even at the height of his career, with everything that was going on for him, you would still find him down the back of a record shop somewhere, going through the cheap rack, looking at the sort of 50p 12 inches just to see what was in there. He was eternally passionate and caring about music. And that's something an awful lot of the rest of us could probably do to try and emulate.
Thank you, Fergal. John Peel was born John Robert Parker Ravenscroft, the son of a cotton broker. He went to school in North Wales and was later a pupil at Britain's prestigious Shrewsbury School. The actor and former Monty Python's Flying Circus comedian Michael Palin was a pupil at the school too, and remembers John vividly.
Well, I was at Shrewsbury School for one term with him, and he was remarkable because he was the only one who played a certain kind of music. And although he was never a house prefect, he was one of the most interesting people I met there. And I remember him lying on his back in his study, just listening to, I think at the time it was probably skiffle. And even at that time, he introduced us to music we'd never heard before, and he was quite a rebel even then, but in a very amusing way. And he always had a terrific wit, and I found him quite remarkable and a very sort of independent sort of voice.
The real defining moment came when John first heard Elvis Presley, his first introduction to American rhythm and blues.
Well, that's all right, Mama. That's all right for you. That's all right, Mama. Just any way you do, that's all right.
John's first break in radio came when his father sent him to America, essentially to find himself. He got a job on a Texas radio station, partly because of his English accent and because the Beatles were just beginning to take off. The American DJ, Paul Gambaccini.
And the funny thing was, the Beatles weren't popular yet when he was first there, which is 1963. The Beatles broke in America in Jan 64, after the assassination of President Kennedy. And Peel himself had met Kennedy and had photographed him when he was stuck in a traffic jam in Dallas. And Kennedy, upon hearing his British accent, said, "Oh, come take some pictures to send back home to England." And he invited John Peel to get on the bonnet of his car, which he did. He took some photos. And he was also present at the indictment of Lee Harvey Oswald, where he said either Oswald was a great actor or truly innocent because he looked like the most befuddled man in history.
Returning to England in 1967, John found work on the pirate station Radio London. His midnight show, The Perfumed Garden, allowed him to broadcast new album-orientated music. By the end of the year, the BBC had launched its own rival pop network called Radio 1, and John Peel was given a 6-week contract. During the 70s, he joined the BBC World Service, and his programme has been there, educating us all about music ever since.
Well, he certainly can play guitar. That's Gary Lucas from the LP The Edge of Heaven, and the track is called The Mad World. And every once in a while I meet somebody who's just heard The Fall for the first time, and they say, "John, which Fall LP should I get? You know, which one do I need to have?" And I have to say to them, frankly, you need to have every record that they've ever made. This is Australians in Europe.
The Fall, possibly the most played band on John Peel's radio shows over the years. A former colleague on the BBC's domestic Radio 1 station was the Canadian broadcaster David Jensen. He recalls what he thought was the key to John's success.
He was particularly good at spotting trends. Very often it would come about by accident that he would start playing something long before anyone else, either a type of music or a particular artist. And very often I would say to him, "What is that?" And he said, "You wait and see, my friend." And then a few months later, he would be right, and I'd end up playing the same stuff on the radio. So he had a very good ear, and it's because he had a child's ear, really. He never really lost his early enthusiasm for music, which started off, as many of his generation in particular, with skiffle and then early rock and roll. And he was a great fan of Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent in the early days.
David Jensen. I'm Mark Coles, and we're paying tribute to our friend and presenter John Peel, who sadly died this week. Well, it wasn't just rock and pop music. John loved all sorts of music from all over the world. I'm joined now by my colleague Charlie Gillett. Charlie, John's music, the music he played on the radio, had a big impact on you, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Well, John is different from everybody that I know who is kind of more than casually interested in music. Most of us kind of get fixated on the distinctions between what we like and what we consider to be beyond contempt. And John didn't have that about him at all, and it continually bewildered me as to how wide his range was. And I couldn't understand it, because while I was kind of burrowing down in the stuff I really liked, and I would finally find a thing that this was the best, John had found it by his own method as well. How did that happen? And in the early days, when I finally realized that I actually preferred music that was not in English, wherever I was driving to a gig, from a gig, all that kind of thing, I would always listen to John on the radio. And one day, driving home, he played this song, which was 9 minutes long. So I got home after about 2 minutes of it, and I had to sit in the car until it finished, both because of how wonderful it was, to hear what it was, and then, of course, one always listened to him as much for what he said between the songs as for what he was playing. So for all those reasons. But I didn't get the name. I didn't understand what he said, so I wrote a letter to him. And a few days later, instead of simply writing a note with the name of the artist, I got an album, a 12-inch vinyl album that he had gone out to buy, especially for me, by Billy Abel. And it is to this day one of probably my top 10 favourite songs of all time.
But that's the wonderful thing about him, isn't it? He was such a fan. He wasn't he wasn't sort of preaching, he wasn't sort of playing, you must listen to this. The music was inside him, he loved it so much. I can imagine him going out and saying, I've got to get that for that DJ, Charlie.
Yes, but also I think I'm illustrating a characteristic of his which can only be known to those who really knew him, because people who don't know him could get a sense of his wit and his, the wonderful comments he would make. But he was an incredibly generous person. Visitors who'd heard him in Germany and somehow made a kind of pilgrimage to his house and knock on his door, and to their complete amazement, the best they could have hoped for was that he would sign a bit of paper or record that they got. He would invite them in, he'd give them a meal, and he might even give them a bed for the night. And he was open in that way, in a way I'd never known anybody else to have that kind of generosity.
Thank you, Charlie.
The Rough Guide people have been putting out LPs for a number of years now. I don't know exactly how many they've released, but one of the most interesting is one that came my way this week called The Rough Guide to African Rap, subtitled Rappers, Rebels and Ragamuffins. And this is by Reggie Rockstone. And exactly what the title is, I'm not absolutely certain, I'll be honest.
The Ghanaian rapper Reggie Rockstone, one of the many global artists that John Peel championed over the years. His friend and former BBC World Service presenter, the DJ Andy Kershaw.
I'll tell you a story of his global significance. The first time I ever went to Timbuktu in northern Mali in the Sahara Desert in December 1988, I came out of my hotel on the first morning and I'd arrived in the middle of the night, so I'd not really seen the town. It was dark and no light. And I blinding light when I woke up in the morning, and I set off down from the hotel, which was on this little hill, into the middle of town. And I'm halfway down this hill, and I saw, sitting under this rather emaciated-looking tree, two Tuareg tribesmen wrapped in blue cloth so that only their eyes were showing, and they had a huge radio set placed between them. And I thought, I wonder what they can be listening to. Perhaps some exotic station from here in Timbuktu, or perhaps from in neighbouring Burkina Faso, or, Niger, or something like that. And just as I got on top of them, I heard coming over the radio, tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum, bang! Ah, your Uncle John Peel playing it, once again here on the BBC World Service. And I thought, well, now, everybody in the world knows that voice.
Andy Kershaw. I saw John do a live DJ set at a music festival in Spain recently. There was a huge crowd of people from all over the world stood watching that one. John meant so much to people in all sorts of different countries. His BBC World Service programmes heard by millions, including the lead singer of the band Drugstore.
Hi, my name is Isabel Monteiro. I was born and brought up in Brazil. I moved to London in about 1990 and was always interested in music, but never thought I would end up starting my own band. Listening to John Peel on the radio was one of the things that really got me into the idea that maybe one day I could start my own band. I think what is most important is that the fact that John Peel made me realize that I wouldn't necessarily need a major record label. Kids could do it for themselves, that you didn't need the money from Polymer, Polygram, or whoever. I remember the first time I actually heard the band on the radio, and you guys have no idea how exciting it was, One day you're sitting in your kitchen with no money to pay the rent. The next thing you turn on, the Late Show, and John Peel is saying, this is the new single from Drugstore. And I remember crying because it was almost too much.
My name's Ken Nishikawa. I'm a radio DJ and TV director working in Turkey. John Peel, he's like this kind of mystic figure that if you send your demo and if it's good enough, he's one of those very few major DJs who really care and who can be bothered to listen to your demo and stuff. So he was like a kind of ray of light of hope for musicians.
One such person who sent his demo tape to John was Lee Dorian, lead singer of the band Napalm Death, who, as you'll hear, represented what many will recognise as the slightly noisier end of John's musical taste.
The fact that I was in a band that got acknowledged by John was just like, still to this day, probably the most exciting, important thing that's happened to me, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of a bit like lost for words about the death of John Peel, because it's something you just don't expect to happen. It's like he's always been there. He's always been there since I was a kid, and he's the kind of person you think's never going to go away. And so for this to happen is like very, very tragic for music and humanity, I think.
As you say, he always surprised people with what he played. A lot of people found it surprising that he was playing Napalm Death, because I mean it was quite an extreme sound, wasn't it? People thought that it was a mad band. A lot of people didn't think you were serious at the time, but John did.
Just talking to somebody about that earlier. I mean, we came from like a really underground scene, and it was literally like the most extreme hardcore and punk kids. We used to go and see Napalm and travel from around the country. There'd be like 100 and 150 people every Saturday night watching the shows. And, you know, as soon as John actually picked up on it, he played a song called You Suffer, which is about just over a second long or something. I remember him completely freaking out about it. The album had just came in that day, and he played it normal speed, he played it backwards, he played it on 45. And then ever since that night, he played like Napalm like every night for like, until now probably, you know. So he was the kind of voice. If he gave you some kind of attention and some acknowledgement, it was a very credible thing. People had so much respect for him that they'd acknowledge that. And you know, from that moment on, that's when Napalm started to get all the kind of notoriety and kind of attention from the press and stuff. And it was pretty much 100% down to him, I would say.
And in case you're wondering what that 1 second song sounds like, here it is. No wonder John kept playing that one over and over again. John's shows weren't just about the records, though. He also invited bands in to perform live, a huge treat for his listeners. Your favourite band playing live on the radio. I can still remember many of those sessions like they were yesterday. Joy Division, Echo and the Bunnymen, the reggae band Misty and Roots, and of course, the Smiths. This was their first single, This Charming Man. Jeff Travis was the manager of the Smiths record label, Rough Trade.
Getting a John Peel session was almost the pinnacle of achievement. I mean, certainly John really liked the Smiths right from the beginning and offered them a session really early on. And, you know, the interesting thing about those sessions is how different they are from the recordings. And one of the most loved of all the Rough Trade records is actually the Smiths' Hat for Apollo record, which is a compilation of a couple of really important John Peel sessions.
That was the Peel session, live version of the Smiths' This Charming Man. Another to benefit from these recordings was the ambient band The Orb, as the group's Alex Patterson recalls.
The beautiful thing there was that from that session, the thing that stands out, that I was getting all these letters from the most obscure places, and I didn't realise until then that Peely actually got into so many different people's heads that weren't like musicians or like artists. It's beyond words. It's this comprehension of the fact that this bloke could convey music before anybody else even knew that it had become popular, and he did it in so many different levels and so many different decades and so many different cultures of music. And yeah, he was very, very sadly lost. Really, really, yeah.
Alex Patterson of The Orb. Well, John loved Jamaican reggae music too, as explained by Brinsley Ford of the British reggae band Aswad.
He was one of the DJs that played a lot of reggae music a lot earlier than a lot of other DJs. I remember one time he played a track that we had done on one of our albums called Love Has Its Ways. And he said, well, there was no info on the band at that time. It was that early. And it was a great feeling. It was family and friends. I had the opportunity to hear your music on BBC or wherever. And it was a great feeling for a young band. So I think that the work that he has done is like the root of a tree. You may not see it, but it's definitely there. I believe that John was very instrumental in playing the Alfie and Donna track very early on. And obviously, once he was playing it, other DJs would have picked up on it, and it went to #1.
See me in the heels and ting. Them checks say we hip and ting. True them no know and ting. We have them going and ting. Now pop, no style.
Althea and Donna's Uptown Top Ranking. John's death this week still hasn't really sunk in, but there's no chance of him ever being forgotten. Anything but. Michael Eavis, the founder of Britain's massive Glastonbury Festival, has announced that the festival's new band stage in future will be renamed in his honour.
Our teenage dreams so hard to beat. Every time she walks down the street, another girl in a neighborhood. Wish she was mine, she looks so good. I wanna hold you tight. Get teenage kicks right through the night. I'm gonna call her on the telephone. I borrow her 'cause I'm all alone. I need excitement, oh I need it bad. And it's the best I've ever had.
John Peel, so much more than just a DJ. A friend to music fans around the world. A man who changed music, who took us on journeys that none of us will ever forget. A cultural icon. For everything you did, for all the memories, God bless you, John. We'll miss you massively.
I know, I'm fabulously lucky. I mean, I do know that. Everything that I wanted when I was a kid. You know, a house in the country, not a big house, but a nice enough place. Dogs, cats, an astounding wife, really nice children. I've had my rows with them, but they're, you know, very proud of them all. And a job on the radio playing records that I like. And I'm getting lots and lots of free records. It's difficult to think what could be added to this to improve it.